begin in a small room in a city built on water, late in the afternoon, when the light has gone the color of weak tea. The room is on the ground floor of a merchant's house in Venice, behind a courtyard, with one high window that faces a wall. There is a table of dark wood, worn pale in two places where forearms have rested for 30 years. There are ledgers on a shelf, bound in vellum, their spines furred with handling. There is a smell of ink and damp stone, and underneath that, something warm and dry and faintly sharp, like wood smoke that has been kept in a box. From a hook above the table hangs a balance. It is a simple thing, a brass beam with a pan swinging on cords at either end, and it is old enough that the maker's stamp has almost rubbed away. The merchant does not hurry with it. He steadies the beam with one finger and waits for the room to be still, because a draft from the courtyard can move a scale of this delicacy. And in this trade, the difference between one reading and another can be the difference between a good year and a poor one. Into the left-hand pan he sets silver, coins worn thin at the edges, each one stamped with the face of a doge or a distant king. He counts them in without ceremony, the way a man counts something he handles daily. The pan sinks and swings and settles. Into the right-hand pan, he pours a handful of small black berries. They are wrinkled and hard, no bigger than the head of a nail. Some are still joined in pairs. They rattle against the brass like gravel. If you saw them on the road, you would step over them without a thought, and if a draft took a few off the table into the corner of the room, they would look like nothing at all. Like grit, like the sweepings of a floor. And yet the merchant leans in as they fall, because he is watching the beam, and the beam is coming level. That is the picture to keep: silver on one side, dried berries on the other, and the brass arm of the balance settling slowly into a line. This is what the next 2 hours are. We are going to follow one dried berry, one peppercorn, and by extension the sack it traveled in, and the cargo that sack belonged to, from a wet green hillside on the far side of the world to a table in Europe. We will go slowly. We will stop in places along the way, in harbors and warehouses and counting rooms much like this one, and we will look at who touched the sack, and what they charged for touching it, and what they were afraid of. The route will take us down a rainy slope in southern India to a river, and along the river to a port, and then out across an ocean at the mercy of a seasonal wind. It will pass through the gates of 3 or 4 empires. It will cross a desert on the back of a camel and a sea in the belly of a galley, and it will end, eventually, at a mill on a kitchen table, which is very likely within a few steps of where you are lying now. But before any of that, there is something worth saying plainly. You do not have to stay awake for this. That is not a politeness. It is the honest shape of the thing. This is a story with no sudden turns in it, no raised voices, nothing that will need you to sit up. If you drift off somewhere in the harbor at Calicut and surface again among the warehouses of Alexandria, you have missed nothing that will trouble you. The ships will keep sailing whether or not you are watching them. The wind will turn in its season. The sacks will be lifted and weighed and argued over and lifted again, and the story will carry on perfectly well without you, and it will still be here if you come back. So let your shoulders come down away from your ears. Let the weight of your head go fully into the pillow, so that the pillow is doing the work and you are not. There is nothing in the next 2 hours that asks anything of you. Now back to the balance and to how strange it is. Because it is strange, and we should be honest about that from the start. Pepper is not treasure. It does not have to be dug out of a mountain or panned out of a riverbed or refined in a furnace. It grows. It grows abundantly on a vine in a warm, wet place, and it grows every year without anyone having to invent it. It is a crop. And yet in medieval and early modern Europe, it was handled with the care given to precious metal, kept in locked chests, weighed on scales fine enough for a goldsmith's work, counted sometimes rather than scooped. You can see it in the way people wrote down what they owned. Pepper turns up in wills. A man setting his affairs in order, dividing a house and a bed and a good cloak, and a few silver spoons among his children, would sometimes think it worth naming a quantity of pepper too, by the pound, as a thing that ought not to be left to chance. It appears in inventories taken after a death, listed alongside the linen and the pewter. Households of any means kept it locked away, and there were spice cupboards with keys, and the keys were carried by somebody trusted. It was used as money, or near enough. In England the habit survives in the language of the law to this day. A peppercorn rent, a rent of 1 peppercorn a year, offered so that an agreement has a price attached even when nobody intends real payment to change hands. That phrase only makes sense because the thing named was once genuinely valuable and genuinely portable, small enough to pass between 2 fingers, real enough to count as payment. Rents were settled in pepper. Dues and tolls and obligations were reckoned in it. Whole trades were built on the handling of it. The pepperers of London were organized as a fraternity in the 12th century, and their descendants became the grocers, named for men who dealt in gross, in bulk. And it was paid in ransom. When Alaric and his Goths stood outside the walls of Rome at the beginning of the 5th century, the terms they set, as the chroniclers of the period record them, included gold and silver and silk tunics, and hides dyed scarlet, and pepper, listed by the thousands of pounds, as one of the things a besieged city was expected to produce in order to buy its own safety. The exact figures are the sort that grow in the telling, and we will not lean on them too hard. But the shape of the demand tells you something all by itself. Someone standing outside a great city with an army at his back thought dried berries were worth asking for. Sit with that a moment without needing to resolve it. A crop. A perennial vine that fruits year after year in ground that is glad to have it. A berry so small that 100 of them would sit comfortably in a closed hand. And grown men weighing it against coin in a locked room, and writing it into their wills, and handing it up to armies at the gate. Which raises the question that this whole long night is built around. Why? Why did this one thing, out of everything that grows, become expensive enough to change the shape of the world? Why did kingdoms build navies over it? Why did men who had never seen a pepper vine, and had only the haziest idea of where the vines even grew, spend their lives and their money, and very often their bodies chasing it around the curve of the planet? There are quick answers, and you have probably met some of them. That people needed it to preserve meat through the winter, that it was medicine, that food in those centuries was so dull or so far gone that pepper was the only thing making it bearable. These answers are tidy and satisfying, and they get repeated with great confidence. And we are going to set every one of them down gently, later on, because they do not survive close contact with the evidence. The true answer is better than the myths, and it is stranger. It has less to do with cooking than with distance, and time and risk and paperwork, with tolls and convoys and licensed harbors, with a small number of people in a small number of places who understood that if you are the only door, then you may name the price of the doorway. But we are not going to reach for it yet. It would not mean much until you have felt the length of the road, not until you have stood in the rain on the hillside where the vines grow and watched a sack change hands for a modest sum among people who will never see what it is finally worth. Not until you have counted the harbors and the customs posts and the ships that did not come home. So we will take our time getting there. That is the whole method of this. To go slowly enough that the answer arrives on its own, the way the shape of a room arrives when your eyes adjust to the dark. For now, just hold the picture of the balance, the brass beam, the silver on one side and the small black berries on the other level, in a dim room in Venice on a gray afternoon. And then let it go, and let the room go with it, and let us travel a very long way east to a place where it is warm, and where it has been raining since morning. It has been raining since morning, and it will rain again tomorrow. That is not a complaint here. It is the arrangement. You are on the western edge of southern India, on a strip of land that runs between the sea and a wall of mountains. The Arabian Sea is a few hours to the west. The Western Ghats stand behind you to the east, dark and steep, and often lost in cloud. Between them lies a green shelf of country perhaps 30 or 40 miles wide, cut by rivers, pooled into backwaters, and soaked twice a year by winds that arrive almost on schedule. In June, the southwest monsoon comes in off the water and does not really stop until September. Later in the year, a second, gentler rain comes down from the northeast. Between them, they give this coast something that most of the world's warm places do not have, which is water that can be counted on. The rain does not fall in the way rain falls in cooler countries. It arrives in weight. It comes through the canopy in ropes, drums on the broad leaves of the plantain, runs off the thatch in a continuous sheet rather than in drops, and turns every red path into a slow red stream. Then it stops, sometimes for an hour, and the light comes back green and underwater, and steam lifts off the ground and the insects start again. Everything here is wet. The wood of the house is wet. The rope is wet. The salt in the jar has gone to a solid lump. You would not think of this as a place that stores things well, and it isn't. It is a place that grows things. Among the things it grows is a vine. It is not much to look at. It climbs. Left alone, it would climb a forest tree and never be noticed, which is presumably what it did for a very long time before anyone bothered with it. Here it has been given a job. Walk into a small holding on this coast, and you will not see a field of pepper because there is no such thing. You will see a garden with several stories. High up, the coconut palms and the tall, thin areca palms with their little rings of shadow. Below them, jackfruit and mango and breadfruit, heavy-limbed and dark. Below that, plantain and taro and yam, and somewhere a few coffee bushes or a patch of ginger in the wetter corner. And running up the trunks of the jackfruit and the areca, tied on when young with a twist of fiber, the pepper vines. They grip. Along the stem, at each joint, the vine puts out short, clinging roots that fasten to bark the way ivy fastens to a wall. Left to itself, a vine will go up 30 feet, which is no use to anybody, so it is topped and trained and kept within the reach of a man on a light ladder or a notched pole. The leaves are dark and glossy and come to a point, and they shed the rain very efficiently, so that standing under a well-grown vine in a downpour is not quite as wet as standing beside it. When the vine flowers, it does so without ceremony. A slender spike hangs down from the joint, pale, a few inches long, unremarkable enough that you could walk past it. Then, over months, the spike sets fruit. Small round berries, packed close along the string, green and hard, a whole catkin of them like a tiny bunch of grapes that never learn to swell. That is all pepper is. That is the entire object at the center of this story. A green berry on a hanging spike, on a climbing vine, on the trunk of a jackfruit tree, on a hillside where it will not stop raining. The year has a shape and everybody on this coast knows it. The rains come and the vines put on growth and set their spikes. The rains ease. The long months of ripening follow. And then, in the cool part of the year, the dry stretch that runs roughly from the end of December into February and March, later on the higher ground the picking begins. It is done by hand. It has always been done by hand. There is no clever way to do it, and there still isn't. A man goes up a bamboo ladder or a pole with the notches cut into it, or simply up the areca palm itself, and works the vine from the top down, and the spikes come off one at a time into a basket slung at the hip or hung from a branch. The judgment is in the timing. You do not wait for the berries to ripen red. You watch for the moment when one or two on a spike begin to turn, the first blush of yellow-orange in a string of green, and you take the whole spike then, while the rest are still hard. Wait longer and the ripe ones fall and the flavor changes. Come too early and the berry is thin and dries to nothing. The baskets come down. The spikes are trodden or rubbed or beaten to strip the berries off the stalk, and the berries are winnowed clean of leaf and stem, and then they are carried out into the sun. This is the part that gives the pepper its face. The berries are spread out on mats, palm leaf mats, woven coir, whatever there is, in a thin layer on the beaten ground of a yard, and left to the dry season sun. Someone turns them with a wooden rake or a bare foot through the day so they dry evenly. and over 3 or 4 or 5 days they change. The green skin darkens, first to a dull brown, then towards black. The berry shrinks around its seed, and the skin puckers into that fine, wrinkled shell that everybody in the world would recognize, and it hardens, and it loses more than half its weight in water. A basket of wet green berries becomes a much smaller heap of something dry and rattling and light. And that, quietly, is the whole trick of it. Because what has happened on those mats is that a piece of perishable tropical fruit, which would rot within days in a climate like this, has turned into a hard, dry object with a stone-like skin that will keep for years, that does not much mind heat, that only mildly minds damp, and that can be poured, weighed, sacked, stacked in a hold, and carried 6,000 miles. Nobody designed that. It is simply a property this particular berry happens to have. Everything that follows in this story, every warehouse, every convoy, every fortress and toll gate and fleet exists because of it. Pepper travels. Almost nothing else grown on this hillside does. Nobody standing in that yard is thinking about any of this. In the yard, it is just work in the sun after months of rain, and children shooing crows, and the smell coming up off the mats, sharp and dusty and warm, that gets into the back of your throat if you kneel too close. The people doing it are not, on the whole, wealthy people. Pepper here is a smallholder's crop. It is grown in gardens of an acre or 2 or 5, tucked between the food crops, tended by a family, sometimes on land they hold, and sometimes on land held above them by a temple or a landlord who takes a share of what comes off it. There are estates, but there is no great pepper plantation running to the horizon, because the vine does not want to be grown that way. It wants a tree to climb and shade over its roots and a hill that drains. So the crop is spread thin across the country, a few sacks here, a few sacks there, gathered from 1,000 small yards. The country itself is a patchwork of little kingdoms and chiefdoms, some of them no bigger than a river valley, all of them backed against the mountains and facing the sea. There are temple towns with tanks of green water and elephants and drums, and mosques on the coast in the local style with tiled roofs and carved wood, built for the Muslim trading families who have been settled here for centuries. There are Christian communities inland who trace themselves back further than most of Europe's cathedrals. There are Jewish merchants at Cochin. This coast has been receiving foreigners and their gods and their money for well over 1,000 years, and it is completely unbothered by them. And in that world, a sack of pepper is worth something, but it is not worth a fortune. It is worth a modest, sensible amount. It is the thing that pays for the cloth, and the metalwork, and the tax, and the wedding. It is a good crop and a valuable one, and it is understood locally to be the best thing this hillside can produce for sale. But nobody in the yard is standing on a fortune. In this country, in the place where every peppercorn on earth comes from, pepper is a farm commodity with a farm commodity's price. Now watch it start to move, because this is where the story of the price begins. The first man is local. He is the one with a shed and a little cash and a set of scales, and he goes around the gardens in the dry season buying what has come off the mats. He may have advanced money against this crop back in the rains, when the family needed it, which is a very old arrangement and never a generous one. He buys small and often. He blends the good with the indifferent. He knows exactly what he can get downriver, and he does not tell you. From his shed, the sacks go to somebody larger, in a market town at the head of a river or a backwater, a man handling the output of a whole district. He has storage that keeps things dry, which matters more than it sounds, and he has standing with the people at the coast. He takes his margin for the risk of holding stock and for knowing where the boats are. Then the water. This is a coast stitched together by water. Rivers come down out of the ghats and slow into lagoons and canals behind the beach, and the pepper goes down them in long, low country boats, poled and paddled, roofed with plaited palm against the weather, riding low with the sacks stacked amidships. It goes past the coconut fringe, past the fish traps, past the ferry crossings, down to the ports on the open sea to Cochin, to Quillan, and above all north to the great one to Calicut. And at each of those transfers the price steps up, not dramatically. Each man's cut is defensible. He carried it, or he stored it, or he lent against it, or he took the risk that the market moved. This is not villainy. This is a supply chain doing the ordinary thing supply chains do. But keep count, because by the time those sacks are stacked on the sand at Calicut, waiting for a merchant with a ship, the pepper has already changed hands 3 or 4 times and has not yet left the country where it grew, and has not yet met a single one of the powers that will really set its price. And here is the thing to hold on to as we leave these hills, because it will be true for the next 1,000 years, and it is true in a great many places still. Of the astonishing sum that will eventually be paid for this cargo in a stone counting house in Venice, the sum that balances against silver, almost none of it comes back here. Not to the family on the ladder, not to the yard or the mats or the woman turning berries with a rake in the January sun. A little of it stops at the broker's shed, a little more at the merchant's warehouse. The rest of it, the overwhelming vast remainder, will be created somewhere else entirely, out on the water and at the customs gates, and in the ledgers of men who have never seen a pepper vine and would not recognize one if they stood beneath it. The grower's share is the smallest number in the whole story. Everything after this is markup. So let the rain come back on. It usually does by evening. The mats are rolled and carried in under the eaves, the dry berries poured into sacks of coarse cloth, the sacks tied at the neck and stacked against the wall where the roof does not leak. Somewhere down the hill, a boat is loading in the last of the light. And in the morning, it will go down the water to the sea, to a port where the wind decides everything, and where the whole world is waiting. The town arrives slowly. First the coconut palms thicken along the shore. Then the smell changes, and you can tell you have come to a place where a great many things are dried in the open air at once. Calicut sits on a low, flat coast with almost nothing to recommend it as a harbor. There is no deep bay here, no sheltering headland, no river mouth wide enough to take a loaded ship. Vessels of any size anchor out in the open roadstead, half a mile or more offshore, rolling gently on the swell, and everything they carry has to come to land in small boats through the surf. It is an awkward arrangement. It has made one of the richest ports in the world. What Calicut has instead of geography is a ruler who decided, generations ago, that foreign merchants should be safe here. The Zamorin, the Samuthieri, the Sea King in the local speech, governs from inland of the beach, and his authority is felt at the waterline mostly as a kind of steadiness. Goods are not stolen. Debts are enforced. A merchant from Cairo or Cambay who leaves a bale on the sand overnight expects to find it in the morning, and travelers from as far as China and Persia wrote home surprised about exactly that. Reputation, it turns out, is a harbor. It does the work that a bay would otherwise do. So the boat that came down the backwater in the morning ties up among 100 others, and the sacks come out of it, and the sacks join a river of sacks moving inland along packed earth streets. Take a moment for the smell, because it is the whole town in one breath. Drying pepper first, dusty and sharp, faintly sweet, a scent that catches at the back of the throat if you stand too long in a weighing yard on a hot afternoon. Under it, coir. Coconut husk soaked in backwater until it rots soft, then beaten and spun into rope, and the whole coast smells of that soaking. Brackish, vegetal, not quite pleasant, entirely ordinary to everyone who lives here. Then cardamom somewhere, and ginger and dried fish, and the tarandoil smell of hulls being worked on above the tide line. Wood smoke over all of it, the whole day long. The warehouses are long, low buildings with thick walls and small windows, and they are kept dark on purpose. Pepper hates damp. A sack that goes into a hold what will come out of it ruined, moldered into a gray clot worth nothing, and the men who own these buildings have learned across centuries exactly how dry is dry enough. So the berries are turned again here, spread again on floors, raked with wooden rakes, watched. In the yards outside, the great beam scales hang from timber frames, and the weighing is done in the open where everyone can see it, because a weight nobody trusts is not a weight at all. Stone counterweights, worn smooth. A man calling the numbers. Another man marking them on a palm leaf strip with a stylus. Letters scratched round rather than straight, because straight lines would split the leaf. And now the thing that governs everything, the wind. Twice a year the whole ocean changes its mind. From roughly June, the southwest monsoon comes up out of the sea and throws itself at this coast for months. The rain you already know, the rain that grows the vines. Nothing sails then. The roadstead empties. The surf makes landing impossible, and the sky sits down on the water, and the port simply stops being a port for a season, and turns back into a wet green town where people mend things and wait. Then the wind swings. From about November it blows the other way out of the northeast off the land, steady and dry, and it will carry a ship across to Arabia and Africa. In the spring the wind turns again and will carry that same ship home. That is the timetable. That is the entire timetable. There is no other. Sit with what that means for a moment, because it explains a great deal that follows. It means a ship does not sail when its owner is ready. It sails when the year says so. Miss the window by a fortnight, by a week, because your cargo was not dry, because your creditor would not release the sacks, because a dispute over duties dragged on at the customs house, and you do not sail late. You do not sail at all. You sit in Calicut with your capital tied up in a warehouse for 6 months, paying storage, watching your pepper slowly lose weight to the air, and you go when the wind comes back around. So the port has 2 speeds and no middle one. For half the year, nothing. Then the wind turns and everyone in the town is awake at once, and the beach becomes a place of shouting and torchlight, and every scale in every yard is working, and nobody sleeps much for weeks. The merchants who do the buying here are not, for the most part, local. They live here, many of them for their whole lives, but their families and their credit reach elsewhere. There are Arab merchants whose networks run to Aden and Jeddah and Cairo, some of them tied to the great Karimi houses of Egypt that moved spice by the shipload for generations. There are Gujaratis from Cambay and the ports of the northwest, who deal in cotton cloth going one way and pepper going the other. There are Persians. There are traders born here to Arab fathers and Malay Ali mothers, at home in both worlds, doing the work that requires being trusted by both. And there are the Zamorin's own officials, who are neither, and who take an interest in all of it. Watch how a bargain is actually written down, because it is stranger and more sophisticated than you might expect. An agreement made in the weighing yard might be recorded in Arabic on paper, for the buyer. The same transaction goes into a Gujarati merchant's own book in his own hand, in a mercantile script his clerks read and outsiders largely cannot. And the local warehouse keeper marks it on palm leaf in the letters of this coast. 3 languages, 3 scripts, 3 ledgers, 1 pile of pepper. None of them is the official record. All of them are. The system works because the people in it expect to face each other again next year, and the year after, and because a man who cheats in Calicut finds the news has reached Aden before he has. Then there is the money that does not exist yet. Very little of this trade is cash for goods on the day. A merchant with a ship to fill, and a wind coming will buy the crop that has not been picked. He advances money, sometimes cloth instead of money, down through the brokers to the hills, against pepper that is still a green string of berries on a vine somewhere above the backwaters. He is buying next year. He is guessing at next year's rain, next year's price in Aden, next year's politics at the other end of the ocean. Everyone in the chain is doing some version of this, and every advance carries its cost, and every cost is added quietly to the same sack. And so we come to the part that matters most and is least visible. At the quay, the Zamorin's customs are assessed, a share of every cargo in or out. This is not corruption, this is the state, and it is what the state is for and what it lives on. The harbor master's office weighs, records, and takes. The port official who oversees the foreign merchants takes his portion too, by right and by custom. And there are the broker's commissions, and the warehouse fees for the weeks in the dark, and the boatmen who ferried the sacks through the surf, and the porters, and the man who wrote the palm leaf, and the guard on the door. None of these is outrageous. Each is a small, reasonable, entirely defensible slice. But run the sack from the hillside to the hold and add them all up, and the pepper that left the grower's yard at a modest local price is worth something like twice that by the time it is stowed on a ship that has not yet gone anywhere. It has not crossed a sea. It has not met a desert. It has not been taxed by a Sultan or bought by a Venetian or carried over the Alps. It has simply moved from a hill to a beach and had its paperwork done, and it has doubled. That is the shape of the whole story appearing early in miniature. Hold on to it lightly. We will meet it again. The loading goes on into the night, because the wind will not wait and the tide is right and the season is short. Torches on the beach, guttering in the offshore breeze. The small boats going out through the low surf, 4 men to each, loaded until the freeboard is a hand's width. Out at anchor the dhow takes them on, and she settles as she fills. You can watch it happen over the hours, the hull sinking down into the black water until the sea is close under the rail. Her planks are sewn together with coir rope, stitched rather than nailed. The way ships have been built on this ocean for a very long time, and she flexes with the swell instead of fighting it. The last sacks go down into the hold sometime before dawn. The hatches are covered. The men sleep an hour or two on deck where they fall. And in the morning, with the land wind behind her, she will stand out into the Arabian Sea with the hills of Malabar going soft and blue behind her, and she will not see land again for weeks. The first days are the hardest to describe because so little happens in them. The land goes down behind you by degrees. First the hills lose their green and become a low blue line. Then the line thins. Then there is a morning when a man looks astern out of habit and finds nothing there at all and does not remark on it, because there is nothing to remark on. The ocean has closed over the coast the way water closes over a stone. After that the ship becomes the whole world, and the whole world is about 60 or 70 feet long. She is a stitched thing. There is not a nail in her hull. The planks are drilled along their edges and sewn together with cord twisted from coconut husk, the same coir that made the ropes and the mats and the sacking in the warehouses at Calicut, and the seams are wadded and paid over with fish oil and lime until they weep only a little. Sewn ships have a reputation among sailors from other seas for looking unfinished. The men aboard would tell you that a sewn hull gives. It works with the swell. It bends where a nailed ship would split, and if she does strike something, she can often be stitched up again on a beach with materials that grow on trees. She smells of that oil and of wet rope, and faintly under everything of pepper. There is one great mast raked forward, and one enormous triangular sail bent to a spar longer than the ship herself, and when the wind is steady on the quarter, there is very little to do but keep her there. The sail is heavy. Shifting it takes every man aboard and a good deal of shouting. So the crew arrange their lives to avoid shifting it, and the ship goes on for days at a time in the same attitude, leaning, hissing, rising, falling, with the water going by along the rail in a long, unbroken sound that never quite becomes silence and never quite becomes noise. The men sleep on deck among the cargo. They cook on a box of sand in the bow. They eat rice and dried fish and dates, and they drink from jars that are counted every day, because water is the true cargo of any voyage, and everything else is only freight. The pilot is the one man aboard who is paid for what is inside his head. He carries no charts of the kind you might imagine. He carries verses. The knowledge of this ocean was set down in rhyme and in prose handbooks. Sailing directions passed from master to apprentice. Where the shoals lie off a certain river mouth. What the water colors mean. Which headland shows 2 humps and which shows 3. How many days from this cape to that island when the wind holds? A skilled pilot of the Western Indian Ocean in these centuries was a learned man, and some of them wrote, and a few of their names have come down to us. At night he takes the height of the stars with a piece of wood and a knotted string. It is a plain instrument, a small rectangular board, a cord threaded through its center, knots along the cord at measured intervals. He holds a knot in his teeth, stretches the cord to its length, and sights the board so that its lower edge sits on the horizon and its upper edge touches the star. The knot he has chosen tells him the height. The height tells him his latitude, more or less, in units of finger widths held at arm's length. It is the sort of measurement that sounds hopelessly rough until you remember that it worked, for centuries, across thousands of miles of open water, and that the men who used it were not guessing. So the nights have a shape, the pilot at the rail, the board against the sky, the pole star sinking a little lower as the ship runs west and south, and the southern stars coming up to meet her. Somewhere out there the routes divide. Off the Horn of Africa, where the sea narrows and the currents turn awkward, lies Socotra, a long dry island of limestone and strange trees, standing exactly where a ship would rather it did not. Past it, one road bends northwest into the narrow gate of the Red Sea, toward Aden. The other bends northwest into the Persian Gulf, toward Hormuz. Almost all the pepper of Malabar that reached Europe went through one of those 2 doors, and both of them had a man standing in the doorway with a ledger. Aden sits in the throat of a dead volcano. Black hills all round, bare as slag, and a harbor in the crater's shadow where the water is deep and the anchorage good, and there is almost nothing to eat or drink for miles. It grew rich anyway, because of where it stands. A ship coming up from India with the season behind her cannot easily slip past Aden and go on. The rulers of Yemen made certain of that. Their officers came out to the arriving ships, and the cargo was landed, and the cargo was assessed, and a portion of its value was taken before a single sack went any further. Then it was loaded again into smaller vessels suited to the Red Sea, which is a treacherous stretch of water full of coral heads and best sailed in daylight and short hops. The great ocean dhows mostly stopped here. The pepper did not. Hormuz did the same work at the other gate. The city had moved out to a barren island in the strait, a place with no farmland and hardly any fresh water, which had to be brought across in boats. It should have been nothing. Instead, it became one of the great markets of the world, because every cargo bound up the Gulf toward Basra and Baghdad, and the caravan roads to Aleppo had to pass within sight of it. Travelers who saw it repeated a saying to the effect that if the world were a ring, Hormuz would be the jewel in it. What they were describing was not fertility. It was a toll gate that had learned to dress well. At each gate the same three things happened. The cargo was taxed. The cargo was transshipped. The cargo was taxed again in some form on the way out. And every one of those operations put a little more distance between the price a grower had accepted on a wet hillside and the price a cook in Europe would one day pay. Not every ship reached the gate. This is the part the ledgers record most quietly. The monsoon that carries you is also a weather system of considerable violence at its edges, and a ship caught out of season is a ship in serious trouble. There are reefs off the African coast that do not appear until you are on them. There is fog. There are the waters around Socotra, which had an evil name among sailors, and the long lee shores of Arabia, where a vessel driven down onto the rocks simply ends. And there were men in fast boats who made a living from cargoes they had not paid for, in the straits and among the islands, where any ship must pass close to land. Merchants knew all of this. They did not think of it as tragedy. They thought of it as a line in the arithmetic. If you send goods on this ocean often enough, some proportion of them will not arrive, and the price you charge on the ones that do must cover the ones that did not. That is the whole logic. Every sack that reached Alexandria was carrying, invisibly, the cost of sacks lying on the sea floor off Gardefeuille. Nobody wrote that on the sack. It was simply understood, and it was built into every quotation ever made. So they spread the risk, the way people have always spread risk when they cannot reduce it. A merchant with enough pepper for one hold did not put it in one hold. He put a quarter of it in 4 different ships, sailing in different bottoms under different masters, and accepted the extra freight and the extra paperwork as the price of not being ruined. He formed partnerships, one man providing capital, another traveling with the goods, the profit divided by an agreement made before either of them left. Families and trading houses did the same across generations, taking small shares in many ventures rather than a whole share in one. It is not insurance as we know it. There is no policy, no premium, no company, but the effect is the same. It turns a catastrophe into a bad year. Letters survive from merchants of this world in which a man reports the loss of a ship, notes what was in her, and moves on in the next line to the price of flax, because he still has 3 other ships out and the business continues. And then, after weeks of nothing but water, the pepper comes ashore for good. At Aden, or at Jeddah further up, or at the small Red Sea ports where the coral shelves let a boat come close, the sacks are landed and counted and weighed and taxed and stacked in warehouses that smell of dust rather than salt. The sewn hulls that carried them are already being caulked for the run home, because the wind will turn, and when it turns they must go. Ahead there is no more water. There is a country of stone and gravel, and towns strung along wells, and men waiting with camels kneeling in the heat. The sea is finished with this cargo. The desert has not started with it yet. The desert starts before dawn, because the men who cross it have learned not to argue with the sun. You would hear it before you saw it. Camels grumble when they are loaded. It is a low, put-upon sound, and it goes on for an hour in the dark while the sacks are lifted and lashed and shifted a hand's width to sit right. 2 bales to a camel, one on each flank, balanced against each other so the animal walks level. A man who loads badly will spend the whole crossing stopping to fix it. So the loading is slow, and it is not hurried by anyone. The pepper is in sacks of coarse cloth now, or in bales sewn into hide, which sheds sand and keeps out the little rain that ever falls here. It has been rebagged more than once since Malabar. Each time a little is lost to the floor and the sweepings, and a little is added back that is not pepper at all, dust, stalk, the light husk of berries that dried badly. Everyone in the chain knows this happens. Everyone downstream will test for it. Nobody stops. Water is the arithmetic that matters here, and it is done out loud, in the open, in front of everyone who will be walking. So many skins for so many men. So many days to the next well, and 1 day's margin beyond that, because wells fail, and because a well that has been drunk dry by the caravan ahead of you is the same as no well at all. The caravan master knows the road as a string of waters with stone in between. He does not think of it as distance. He thinks of it as thirst, divided into portions. Then they go. From Jeddah's side of the sea, the cargo has crossed to the Egyptian shore, to Qusair, or up to the head of the Gulf at Suez, or in the older years to ports further south that silted and emptied and are now only names. From those beaches, a track runs inland through hills the color of ash, and the track is not a road. It is a wearing. Generations of feet and hooves have polished a line through the gravel, and you could follow it in poor light, by the way it shines slightly differently from the ground on either side. They walk in the cold part of the day, before sunrise, and again in the long amber hours after the heat breaks. In the middle of the day the animals are couched and the men sit in whatever shade a stack of bales can be made to throw, and nobody talks much, and the pepper sits in the sun getting a little drier and a little lighter, and therefore a little cheaper by weight, which is one of the small, quiet losses nobody bothers to write down. There are bones by the track, camel mostly. They are not a warning, they are furniture. A road this old accumulates them the way a house accumulates dust. And then, after days of stone, the land changes its mind. There is a green line, and it is a hard green, a shocking green if you have been looking at gravel since the coast. The Nile does not fade in at the edges. It arrives. Palms, mud brick, a donkey standing in water up to its knees, children, the smell of wet earth and smoke. The camels are unloaded at a river town, and the bales go from backs to boats, and the rhythm of the journey changes again, from the swing of an animal's stride to the slow northward pull of the current. Downriver is easy. That is the gift of the Nile. It runs north while the wind blows south, so a boat sails up and drifts down, and the whole country is arranged around that convenience. The pepper goes down with the water. It passes towns where nobody looks up. It passes fields being flooded or drained depending on the month. It takes its time. Cairo is where the counting begins in earnest. The city is enormous by any standard the pepper has met so far, bigger than Calicut, bigger than Aden, a place of minarets and citadel walls and streets so narrow that upper stories nearly touch. The sultans who rule from that citadel are Mamluks, soldiers of slave origin raised to command, and their state runs on two things: the army and the tax on other people's cargo. Pepper is the second of those made visible. It arrives at the river quays in sacks, and from the moment it is landed it belongs in part to the Sultan. Not by seizure, by process which is slower and works better. There is a gate, and at the gate there is a customs house, and at the customs house there is a scribe with a register. The bales are weighed. The weight is written. A share is assessed. There is a second office for a second kind of due, and a third man whose right to a portion of the goods is old and specific and not to be argued with. Each of them takes a little. None of them takes so much that trade stops, because these are not thieves. They are administrators, and an administrator wants the caravan to come again next year. The genius of the arrangement is its moderation at every single step, and its ferocity in total. The merchants who handle this trade in Egypt are men of a particular kind, long-distance spice traders with agents in Aden and correspondents in the Indian ports, wealthy enough to lend to princes, careful enough not to be seen doing it too visibly. Their fortunes are built on knowing when a fleet left Calicut, and who else knows. For a long stretch of years they are the trade. Then a sultan decides that if pepper is going to make someone rich in his territory, it may as well be him, and the state begins buying at the price it names and selling at the price it prefers, and the merchants become, by degrees, the sultan's brokers rather than his rivals. Some grow richer on the arrangement, some are ruined by it. The pepper does not notice. In Cairo, the bales go into warehouses, and this is where you meet the oldest trick in the whole story. The warehouse is not storage. The warehouse is a lever. Consider what the men holding the keys know. They know how much pepper came up the Red Sea this year because they landed it. They know roughly what is still on the water because ships talk. And they know that the buyers waiting at the coast have a deadline, because those buyers came on wind and must leave on wind, and a wind will not wait for a negotiation. So the pepper stays inside, not all of it, enough. Sacks are released into the market slowly in measured quantities, and the price is watched the way you would watch a pot, and if it sags, less comes out. If a rumor arrives that the Indian crop was heavy, less comes out still, and the rumor is denied by people who know it is true. It is a simple idea, and it will be rediscovered by every generation that handles a scarce good. Scarcity is not always found. Very often it is made, by someone with a dry room and the patience to wait. Down the river, the last stretch is easy water, and then Alexandria, and salt in the air again for the first time since the Arabian Sea. Think about what has happened to this bale. It grew on a vine on a wet hill in Malabar and was sold for a modest sum to a man who lived 20 miles from the vine. It went by broker and river and coastal boat to Calicut. It crossed an ocean in a sewn hull. It was landed and taxed at a Red Sea gate, carried by camel across a stone desert, floated down the longest river in the world, weighed and assessed and weighed again in Cairo, held back in a locked room until the price improved, and now it stands at a quay on the Mediterranean. 4 empires near enough have had their hands on it: the kingdoms of the Pepper Coast, the Sultanate that held the Red Sea, the Mamluk state of Egypt, and the merchant republics that will take it from here. Count the sails and you will lose track somewhere around the 9th. Every one of those hands was paid. Not one of them was paid unreasonably. That is the whole trick. And at Alexandria, out beyond the harbor mouth, there are the galleys. They ride at anchor with their oars shipped and their yards down, long low hulls from the north, painted and gilded at the stern, in a way that no vessel in this story has been painted before. They came together on a fixed date under an agreed flag. They are not permitted to simply come ashore and buy. There is a quarter of the city set aside for them, with a gate that is locked at night, and a consul who is responsible for their behavior, and a set of rules about where they may go and when. They wait for permission. They wait for the price to be announced. They wait, some years, for weeks, while the men with the warehouses decide how much pepper the world is going to have. The crews fish over the side. The officers walk the same short stretch of deck. Somewhere in the city, in a cool room, a clerk turns a page. The pepper is very close to Europe now. It has never been more expensive. The permission comes eventually. It always comes. The galleys are let in, and the loading begins in the flat heat of an Egyptian morning, and by the time the last sack is stowed, the whole shape of the thing has changed hands one final time. It is Venetian now. It belongs to the Republic, or to men the Republic allows to own things, which in practice is much the same. These are not ordinary ships. They are the great galleys of the merchant fleet, wide-bellied and oared, built in the state yards, and they do not sail whenever a captain feels like sailing. They sail in a convoy. The convoy has a name, the Muta, and the Muta is a creature of the Senate. Each year the Senate decides how many galleys will go, and where, and when they will leave, and when they must be back. The dates are announced in advance. Merchants plan their whole year around them. A man in Nuremberg who has never seen the sea knows roughly which month the pepper will come, because a council of elderly men in a hall on the lagoon voted on it. The galleys themselves are not owned by the merchants who fill them. They are owned by the state and rented out, auctioned to the highest bidders among the patrician families, with conditions attached. The captain of the convoy is a state appointment. The route is fixed. The armament is specified. There are limits on what may be carried and by whom, And there are penalties for sailing early, and penalties for sailing late, and penalties for straying from the fleet. A galley that wanders off alone is a galley inviting a corsair to make a decision. It is worth pausing on how strange this is if you are still with us. Venice is a city of merchants that has decided its merchants cannot be trusted to organize themselves, so it does the organizing. It builds the ships, sets the sailing dates, appoints the officers, fixes the freight rates, and takes a share of everything. It is a shipping company with a navy attached, or a navy with a shipping company attached, and nobody in the city would find the distinction very interesting. The Republic is the sea. The sea is the business. The voyage home is the easy one, relatively speaking. The Mediterranean in the sailing season is a known quantity, and the galleys hug coastlines they have hugged for centuries, and there are islands the Republic holds precisely so that its ships have somewhere to shelter and take on water. Crete, Corfu, Madon and Coron on the Greek coast, called the two eyes of the Republic, because from them you can see who is coming. The pepper passes them in the dark. It has been afloat in one hull or another for the better part of a year. And then the lagoon. The low line of it first, barely a line at all, and the campaniles standing up out of the water with nothing underneath them that you can see. The galleys come in through the channels that only pilots know, and the sacks are landed and weighed again. The Republic weighs everything always at its own scales, by its own officials, with its own record kept, and the duty is assessed, and the pepper goes into a warehouse a short walk from the market. The market is at the Rialto. It is not much to look at. A crooked bridge of wood in these years, with a drawbridge in the middle that lifts for masts. A church that is very old and very small. Around them, arcades, benches, tables, a covered loggia, a jumble of banks and stalls and shipping offices, and the noise of several hundred men doing business at close quarters in a space you could walk across in 2 minutes. Here the pepper stops being a thing and becomes a number. You should understand that hardly anyone at the Rialto ever sees a peppercorn. The sacks are in the warehouse. What moves in the market is the claim on them, a written obligation, a bill, an entry in a banker's book. The bankers sit at the Rialto with their ledgers open, and a payment between two merchants is often nothing but a clerk crossing out one line and writing another, the money never leaving the building, or existing anywhere at all in a form you could put in a purse. Pepper is quoted like a currency because it functions like one. It is dense, it does not spoil quickly, it is wanted everywhere, and everyone agrees roughly what it is worth. That is most of what a currency is. So it is sold forward, before the fleet has even left Alexandria. It is pledged against loans, the sacks sitting in the dark as security for money spent on something else entirely. It is used to settle debts between men who never intended to trade in spice at all. A dowry is arranged, and part of it is pepper. A ship is refitted, and the yard is paid partly in pepper. Cargoes are bought and sold 3 times over while still on the water, and by the time the sacks are opened, the profit or loss on them has already been distributed among people who will never touch them. The brokers move between the tables. The Republic licenses them, because of course it does, and takes a fee from their work, because of course it does. Everything at the Rialto is watched by someone whose job is to write down what happened and calculate what is owed. There is a magistracy for weights. There is a magistracy for fraud. There is a magistracy, more or less, for magistracies. Somewhere in the middle of it, prices are made, and the prices made here become the prices in cities 1,000 miles inland, because there is nowhere else to make them. Now watch where it goes. A few minutes' walk from the market on the Grand Canal stands a large building where the German merchants live and work. The Fondaco dei Tedeschi, the Germans' warehouse. They are not guests exactly. They are required to be there. A merchant from Augsburg or Nuremberg who comes to Venice to buy pepper must lodge in that building, store his goods in that building, and conduct his transactions in that building, through Venetian brokers, under the eyes of Venetian officials who record every sale and assess the duty on it. He may not deal directly with a Venetian supplier. He may not slip around the side. The Republic has taken the entire northern trade and put it in one house with a door it controls. From that door the pepper goes north on the backs of mules and in carts, up through Treviso and the valleys, over the Alpine passes in the months when the passes are open, past toll stations at every bridge and gorge and boundary where somebody with a right to charge has set up a bar across the road. Each toll is small. There are a great many of them. It comes down into Germany at Augsburg and Nuremberg is a wonder in its own right. An inland city grown rich on being the place where roads cross, its merchants handling spice they will never see growing, forwarding it west and north. From there it goes to the Rhine and down the Rhine, and out to Bruges and Antwerp, where the whole of northern Europe comes to buy. Venetian galleys sail the western route too, out past Gibraltar to Southampton and London and the Flemish ports, carrying pepper directly to a wet gray coast that has no idea what a monsoon is. And by the time it arrives in a market in England or Flanders or Poland, it has been through the hands of the grower, the village broker, the coastal middleman, the Calicut merchant, the shipowner, the transshipper at Aden or Hormuz, the caravan master, the Cairo warehouseman, the Alexandrian factor, the Venetian galley, the Rialto banker, the German at the Fondaco, and the local grocer. Each of them lived. Each of them lived off the difference. You can see what that difference bought, because it is still standing. Go along the Grand Canal and look at the houses. They are not fortresses, which is itself remarkable. They are decorated, open, pierced with windows, faced with marble and stone shipped in at ruinous expense, because their owners never expected an army to arrive. The Ca d'Oro has gilding on its carving. The palaces have warehouses on the ground floor and ballrooms above, which tells you everything. The wealth and the work occupied the same address, and nobody thought it undignified. Go further east and there is the arsenal, behind its own walls, a shipyard the size of a town, with rope walks and foundries and timber yards, and a workforce with its own quarter and its own pride. It can build hulls in series, fitting them out along a channel as they pass, and it can put a fleet to sea in a season. All of it is paid for. All of it is paid for out of a ledger, and a great deal of that ledger, year after year, is spice, pepper above all, because pepper moves in the largest quantities and pepper is what the North wants most. A dried berry from a hillside in Kerala, in enough quantity, over enough years, becomes a stone city on a mudflat with a navy. And this is the point where you may find something quietly nagging at you. You have followed this cargo across an ocean and a desert and a mountain range. You have watched a dozen honest men take honest margins. You have watched taxes levied by 4 different powers. You have watched a state fix the dates, license the brokers, lock the Germans in a house, and count everything twice. And still, at the end of all of it, the number is extraordinary. Not high, extraordinary, far past what a year of freight and a stack of tolls should produce. Something else is going on. You are close to it now. But not tonight, not just yet. We will take it slowly and in order, and the answer will keep until the next hour begins. There is a thing people say about pepper, and it is worth setting down gently before we go any further. They say the medieval world needed it, that meat spoiled, that kitchens were foul, that a fistful of ground pepper was thrown over the turning edge of a joint to hide what it had become. It is a tidy story. It explains a high price with a desperate need, and it is not true, or at least not true in the way it is usually told. Think about who was buying. A pound of pepper on the Rialto cost more than most people saw in a season. The households that could afford it were households with land, with herds, with a bailiff and a slaughter yard and a cool cellar. They ate their beef fresh because they could. When they wanted to keep meat through winter, they used salt, which came out of pans on the Atlantic coast and mines in the Alps, and cost a very small fraction of what pepper cost. Nobody who could afford to season rot could not also afford to avoid it. The people eating questionable food were the people who had never in their lives held a peppercorn. So set that one down. It is not the answer. Set down the medicine, too, though more carefully, because that one has real weight behind it. Pepper does appear in the physician's books, all through the Greek and Arabic and Latin traditions. It is hot and dry in the scheme of things, useful against phlegm and chills and a cold stomach, folded into electuaries with honey and ginger and a dozen other imported powders. Apothecaries kept it in a locked drawer. All of that is real, but the trade we have been following was never sized to the sickroom. The bales came in tons. The galleys came in fleets. You do not build an arsenal on the strength of a cough remedy. And set down, last and most reluctantly, the idea that pepper simply tasted so good that people paid anything for it. It did taste good. It still does. But that only tells you why someone wanted it. It does not tell you why a dried berry sat level against silver on a merchant scale. The answer is in 2 halves. The first half you already know, because you have spent the last several hours watching it happen. The first half is distance. Not distance the way we think of distance now. Not a number on a map. Distance as a year of your life. The pepper on that Venetian counting house scale was picked green on a hillside in Malabar by someone who has been dead, in the telling, for a long time already, because the journey took so long that the picking is old news by the time the weighing happens. Rain, then sun, then mats, then sacks. Then a riverboat, then a coastal boat, then a warehouse waiting on a wind that only turns twice a year, then weeks of open sea, then a strait, a customs shed, a second hold, then camels and a desert measured in wells rather than miles, then a river, then a delta, then a galley, then the Alps. 6,000 miles, more or less, and none of it fast. The wind decides when you leave. The wind decides when you arrive. If you miss the season, you do not lose a week. You lose half a year, standing in a warehouse in a hot port, paying rent on your own cargo. And a fraction of it never arrived at all. That is the part that is easy to say quickly and worth saying slowly. Ships went down. Not all of them, not most of them, but enough that every merchant in the chain built the possibility into his price before he built anything else. Reefs off the Socotra approaches. Storms that came earlier than the pilots expected. A hull that opened it seems a week from land. Corsairs in the Narrows, where the water pinches and everyone must pass close to shore. Nobody sailed expecting to sink. Everybody priced as though they might. You saw how they handled it. 4 hulls instead of 1. A quarter share to a cousin, a quarter to a partner in another town, the rest spread thin enough that a sinking is a bad year rather than a ruined family. That works. It genuinely works, but it is not free. Every share sold, every partnership formed, every guarantee written into a contract in 3 scripts, all of it is a cost, and all of it lands on the berry. Now the arithmetic, take it slowly, there is no hurry. Here is the thing about a chain of honest men. Each one takes a modest margin. The village broker takes a little. The coastal middleman takes a little. The boatman takes his freight. The Calicut warehouse takes storage, and the harbour master takes his fee, and the Zamorin's customs officers take theirs at the quay. The shipowner takes freight and risk. Aden takes a duty. The transshipper takes a margin. Hormuz takes a duty. The caravan master takes his charge and his water and his losses. The Sultan's officials take their share at one gate and again at the next and again at the port. The Venetian buyer takes his margin. The German merchant takes his. The apothecary in Nuremberg takes his. Count them on your fingers if you like. You will run out of fingers. And here is the quiet cruelty of it. These do not add. They multiply. Each hand does not take a coin from a fixed pile. Each hand takes a proportion of whatever the price has already become. So the third man's modest third is larger than the second man's modest third, and the ninth man's is larger still, and every toll is levied on a value that every previous toll has already inflated. Imagine, only as an illustration, that each pair of hands roughly doubles the price. Not because that is a measured figure. The real numbers varied by year and route, and how the harvest had been, but because it shows you the shape. Double it once, and you have doubled it. Double it 7 times, and the number is over 100 times what you began with. Nothing in that sequence was greed. Every single step was a man taking a living, and the end of it is a price that has nothing recognizable in it of the sack that left the hills. That is the first half of the answer. Distance, time, risk, and compounding. It is a great deal of the answer. It explains a very expensive spice. It does not explain silver. Because if that were all of it, if pepper were simply expensive the way anything hauled across the world is expensive, then you would expect the price to fall whenever the season was good and the crossing was calm. You would expect competition to grind the margins down. You would expect somebody, somewhere along 6,000 miles, to undercut the man in front of him. That is not what happened, and the reason is the second half. The second half is that the price was chosen. Not by one person. Nobody sat in a room and set a figure for the world. But at every narrow point along that route, someone was in a position to decide and decided. The monsoon made the route narrow to begin with, 1 season out, 1 season back, no way around it. Then geography narrowed it further. Aden, Hormuz, the Red Sea mouth, the Nile. Water that a state could close with a chain and a few ships. Everything had to pass through, and everyone who held a gate knew what a gate was worth. Then people narrowed it on purpose. The Sultan's officials in Cairo and Alexandria did not simply tax the pepper, they held it. Stock went into a warehouse and stayed there while the buyers waited on the water, and it came out when the price was right, and the price was right when there was not very much of it. That is not a tax. That is a decision about scarcity. And Venice, which you have just spent an hour with, did the same thing with better bookkeeping. Fixed sailing dates. State convoys, not private ones. A licensed set of buyers. Foreign merchants housed where the Republic could watch them. Records kept in duplicate. If you wanted pepper north of the Alps, you came to one city, and that city had already decided what the number would be. So here is what the merchant scale is actually weighing, in that dim room, with the peppercorns on one pan and the silver on the other. Not flavor, not medicine, not spoiled meat. It is weighing a year of sailing. It is weighing the ships that did not come back. It is weighing 9 or 12 honest margins stacked on top of one another until they stopped looking honest. And then, on top of all of that, it is weighing a set of deliberate choices made by people who controlled a door and understood exactly what a door is worth. Scarcity was the product. The pepper was almost incidental, a light, dry, durable thing that happened to be perfect for carrying value across the world, and happened to grow in exactly one place at the far end of exactly one route. It could almost have been anything. It was this. Which leaves one obvious thought, the one that must have occurred to somebody eventually. Standing on a wharf in Lisbon looking at the price of a spice, and then out at the open Atlantic. If the chain is what costs so much, why use the chain at all? It is a thought that would have been hard to have anywhere but Lisbon. The city sat at the edge of the known map with its back to Europe, looking down the Tagus at water that went nowhere anybody had drawn. The Venetians had no reason to think it. They had the door, and the door was profitable. But the Portuguese had spent most of a century creeping down the coast of Africa in small ships, a few hundred miles at a time, planting stone pillars on headlands, and coming home with gold dust and enslaved people, and a slightly longer chart. They had learned the wind of the South Atlantic almost by accident, that you do not hug the coast southward, you swing far out west into the open ocean, into what looks like the wrong direction entirely, and let the great circling wind bring you back around to the bottom of Africa. It cost weeks of nerve. It worked. So the thought took shape in the counting rooms above the river. Every markup in the chain was a person who had to be paid. The village broker, the coastal agent, the shipowner at Calicut, the customs man at the quay, the harbor master, the shipper at Aden, the officials at Hormuz, the caravan master, the Sultan's men at every gate in Cairo, the Venetian buyers at Alexandria, the galley freight, the Rialto, the Alpine passes, the German houses in the north. 12 months of it. A dozen hands. And each of those hands was, from Lisbon's point of view, a thing that might simply be removed. Not negotiated with. Removed. If the chain was the cost, then a ship that sailed from Portugal to Malabar and back with nobody in between would carry pepper home at a price nobody in Europe could match. 4 ships left Lisbon in the summer of 1497 to test the idea. They were not many and they were not large. Vasco da Gama commanded them, a man chosen more for hardness than for seamanship. They went out past the tower at Belém, past the beach at Restilo where the crews had heard mass the night before, and then west and south into 3 months of empty water, the longest open sea passage anyone in Europe had yet attempted on purpose. They came back to land far down the African coast. They rounded the Cape in November in heavy weather. They went up the eastern side of Africa into a world they did not understand at all, into ports where the ships were bigger than theirs, and the merchants had been trading across that ocean for centuries, and found these ragged Atlantic visitors slightly comic. At Malindi, they took on a pilot who knew the crossing, and with the summer monsoon behind them, they came over the Arabian Sea in something under a month, and in May of 1498, they anchored off the beach at Calicut. And nothing happened. That is the part of the story that gets left out. The most consequential voyage in the history of the spice trade arrived and was received with a shrug. The Zamorans' court had seen better. When the Portuguese gifts were laid out for inspection, striped cloth, hats, strings of coral, some sugar, some oil, a little honey, the officials looked at them and told the visitors without much cruelty that this would not do. The poorest merchant coming from Mecca gave gold. Nobody carried honey to a king. Da Gama had brought the trade goods of the West African coast to one of the richest ports in the world, and they were not gifts. They were the wrong century's cargo, offered to the wrong court. What followed was months of stiff misunderstanding, audiences granted and then delayed, customs officials who wanted the usual duties from a stranger who had come to avoid duties, a short detention ashore. The resident Muslim merchants, who had every reason to see where this was going, offering the Zamorin quiet and accurate advice. Da Gama got his cargo in the end, but he bought it badly, on poor terms in modest quantity, and he left in August in the teeth of the wrong wind because he did not understand the monsoon and would not be told. The crossing back to Africa took 3 months instead of 1. Scurvy did what scurvy does. He lost so many men he had to burn one of his own ships for lack of hands to sail it. 2 of the 4 came home. Something like a third of the men who had sailed came back with them. And the pepper and cinnamon in the hold, bought clumsily at a bad price by a man with no leverage, sold in Lisbon for far more than the entire expedition had cost to mount. Ships, wages, stores, the burned vessel, the dead, all of it repaid out of a partial cargo, with a great deal left over. That was the whole argument, settled in one accounting. Everything after it follows from that single sum. The fleets that went out afterwards were not exploratory. They were armed. Within a few years, the Portuguese had understood something about that ocean that changed their strategy entirely. The ships of the Indian Ocean were merchant ships, built for cargo and weather, not for fighting. They did not carry heavy guns because there had been nobody to fight. The Atlantic ships were slower, uglier, worse in a following sea, and they had cannon down both sides. A Portuguese carrack could not outsell a Gujarati merchant. It could sink one. So the plan changed shape. If you cannot buy the pepper cheaper than everyone else, you take control of the places the pepper must pass through, and then everyone else buys it from you. What grew out of that was the Estado da India. Not a colony in the later sense, not a territory, but a string of fortified points around the rim of an ocean, held with stone and gunpowder and very few men. Afonso de Albuquerque was the one who drew the map. Goa, taken in 1510, became the capital, a fine city on an island, with a viceroy and a cathedral and a garrison. Malacca in 1511, the strait through which the eastern spices came west. Hormuz at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, the toll gate you already know. They tried for Aden and failed, and that failure would matter more than anyone realized at the time, because Aden was the door to the Red Sea, and the Red Sea was the old road to Cairo. And then the paperwork. This is the detail that says most about what the Portuguese thought they had built. Every merchant ship in the Indian Ocean was now required to carry a Portuguese pass, the cartas. It cost little. That was not the point. The pass named the ship, the master, the cargo, and it obliged you to call at a Portuguese port and pay Portuguese customs, and it forbade you certain goods. A ship without one could be stopped, taken, or burned. A crown on the far side of the world, with perhaps a few thousand men in the whole ocean, had declared itself the licensing authority for a sea that had been open since before Rome. It was an astonishing piece of nerve. Written on a single sheet of paper, it made the Indian Ocean, in law, Portuguese property. The trouble is that a monopoly is a very easy thing to announce, and a very hard thing to keep. The ocean was too big. The coastline of Malabar alone is hundreds of miles of creeks and river mouths and small harbors, where a country boat can load 40 sacks at night and be gone by morning. Pepper grew on thousands of small plots belonging to thousands of growers, none of whom had signed anything. Portuguese officials in Goa were badly paid and lived a long way from Lisbon, and a man who has crossed the world once is often persuadable about what goes into the ledger. Local rulers found the pass system tolerable when a fleet was in sight and forgettable when it was not. And every year a certain volume of pepper simply went the old way, up the coast, across to Arabia, into the Red Sea, past Aden, which the Portuguese had never taken, up to Suez, onto camels, into Cairo. By the middle of the 16th century, the old road was carrying nearly as much as it ever had. The Venetians were buying at Alexandria again. The chain had been declared broken and had quietly knitted itself back together, because a chain made of 1,000 small profits is not a thing you can cut in one place. But the first blow had landed, and it landed where it hurt most, in the price. The Portuguese sent their pepper up to the north themselves, to Antwerp, where the crown kept a factory to sell it into Germany and the Low Countries and England, the very markets that Venice had fed over the Alps for 2 centuries. Now the same goods arrived by sea in bulk, without the Alpine freight or the Egyptian tolls. Antwerp began to quote a price. Then it began to sag. In Venice, they read the reports from Lisbon in the first years of the new century with something close to disbelief, and then with a cold, precise understanding of what it meant. The diarists of those years recorded the news and recorded what the merchants around them thought of it, and the thought was not complicated. If the pepper can come round Africa, then the Rialto is no longer the only place in Europe where pepper is priced. Nothing collapsed. Venice traded on and traded well for a long time yet. But the men in the counting houses had felt something they had never felt in 200 years of holding the door, the small, unmistakable sensation of a floor beginning to tilt. The answer to a tilting floor, if you are a merchant in a cold northern city, is not to sail one ship. It is to sail many and to sail them forever. Think about what a voyage had been until then. A voyage was a single, enormous, terrifying bet. A group of men put up money, bought a hull, filled it with silver and cloth and biscuit, and watched it leave on the tide. 2 years later or 3, the ship came home, or it did not. If it came home, the venture was wound up, the cargo sold, the profits divided, and the partnership dissolved like a meeting breaking up. If it did not come home, the money was simply gone. Every voyage began at 0 and ended at 0. Nothing accumulated but experience and grief. The merchants of Amsterdam and Middelburg and Rotterdam had been doing exactly this through the last years of the 16th century, in small rival companies, and they had been doing it badly. They bid against one another for cargo in Asia and undercut one another selling it at home. They raised the price of pepper where it grew and lowered it where it was sold, which is precisely the wrong way round, and everyone concerned could see it. In London, The same instinct had already produced a charter from the old queen in the very last days of 1600, granting a body of merchants the exclusive English right to trade east of the Cape. It too funded itself voyage by voyage at first, subscription by subscription, each fleet its own small world of accounts. In 1602, the Dutch did something more radical. The States General, the Assembly of the young Republic, pressed the quarreling companies together into one body. The United East India Company, known ever after by its 4 letters and its interlocked monogram, stamped on chests and cannon and coins. The capital was not raised for a voyage. It was raised once, from anyone who wished to subscribe, from great merchants and from maidservants with a few guilders, and it stayed in. You could not ask for your money back. You could only sell your share to someone else, which is why a street in Amsterdam soon filled every day with men trading paper in a company none of them would ever see. Read the charter slowly and you find the strange part. It gave this trading company the right to build fortresses, to keep soldiers, and to make them swear loyalty to the company, to sign treaties with kings and sultans in its own name, to wage war, to seize enemy ships and keep the proceeds, to appoint governors, to hold courts, to hang men. These were the powers of a state, handed over in a commercial document, and handed over because the Republic itself was at war with Spain and had neither the ships nor the money to project itself around the world. So it lent its sovereignty out at interest to a firm. The result was something the world had not quite seen before. Not a kingdom with a trading arm, a trading company with a country inside it. The change you would have noticed first was the change in permanence. In 1619, the company took the port of Jakarta on the north coast of Java, burned much of what stood there, and built on the site a walled town of canals and brick and gabled houses, in the manner of home, in a climate that would kill Europeans in that town at a rate its own records could not disguise. They called it Batavia. It had warehouses, a castle, a shipyard, a hospital, a church. It had a governor-general and a council, and it meant that the company no longer came and went. It stayed. Everything followed from staying. Ships no longer had to sail all the way from Europe to buy a cargo. The cargo could be bought and stored months before a hull arrived to take it. Fleets could be kept in Asian waters permanently, moving between Java and Ceylon and Japan and the Bay of Bengal, trading Indian cotton for spices, spices for Japanese silver, silver for more cotton, so that the Eastern operation ran and profited without European money at all for stretches at a time. Men signed on for years. They kept ledgers in Batavia that never closed, that simply carried forward, page after page, the way a country's books carry forward. And once the books carry forward, a new kind of thought becomes possible. If you own the warehouse and you will still own it next year, then you no longer have to sell what you have. You can decline to sell. You can hold a cargo through a season and another, and let the shortage do your arguing for you. And if you can hold what you have, you can also destroy what you have, which is a far stranger idea, and one the company took to with a thoroughness that still reads coldly on the page. In the eastern islands, where the fine spices grew, the company's fleets made regular voyages between the islands in rowed native craft, with soldiers aboard, to find and cut down clove trees growing outside the districts where the company permitted them, not to steal the crop, to end the tree. A grove that produced spice the company could not control was, in the arithmetic of the ledger, a liability, and so it was felled and burned, and the ground left. Nutmeg was concentrated by force onto a handful of tiny islands and made illegal everywhere else within reach. Later, in Amsterdam itself, there are accounts of surplus spice being burned in the open before witnesses, on stacked wood, the whole town smelling of cinnamon and nutmeg for days, while the price on the exchange was held where the directors wished it to be. Merchants had always understood scarcity. This was the first time a private organization was manufacturing it at industrial scale, on purpose, with fire. You should know what that cost, because the ledgers do not hide it. They simply record it in the same neat hand as the weights and the freight charges. The Banda Islands are very small. You could walk across the largest of them in a morning. They were, at that time, the only place on earth where nutmeg grew in quantity, and their people had traded it for centuries with anyone who arrived, on their own terms, playing buyers against one another as any sensible seller does. The company wanted an exclusive contract. The Bandanese signed things they did not read as the company read them, and kept selling to others, and the company called that a breach. In 1621, the Governor-General came with soldiers and Japanese mercenaries and took the islands. What followed was not a battle. Most of the population was killed or starved in the hills or carried off into slavery in Batavia. A small remnant escaped by sea to other islands. The nutmeg groves were then divided into numbered plots and handed to Dutch and mixed descent planters, who were supplied with enslaved workers, many of them Bandanese, brought back to work the very trees their families had tended, and required to sell the entire crop to the company at a price the company set. Garrisons held the forts. Ships watched the water. It worked. That is the part that is hardest to sit with. The monopoly in nutmeg and mace held for the better part of 2 centuries, and it held because a people had been removed from an island to make a plantation of it, and the removal appears in the correspondence as a policy successfully executed. The English, pushed out of those islands after a brutal affair at Amboina in 1623, that poisoned relations between the 2 nations for a generation, went west instead to Surat, to the Coromandel coast, to Bengal, and to the pepper ports of Sumatra. That turn, made in defeat, would matter more in the end than anything they had lost. And pepper quietly was slipping out of the story it had made. Pepper could not be cornered. It grew on Malabar and on Sumatra and on Java and in a dozen places between on smallholders' plots, on any hillside with rain and a tree to climb. You could burn a clove grove on a small island. You could not burn a coastline. Every attempt to control pepper at the source met the same wall. Too many growers, too much geography, too many buyers willing to slip a cargo out at night. So pepper became something else. It became bulk. It became the heavy, reliable, unglamorous freight that filled the lower holds and paid the running costs, while the profit came from nutmeg and cloves and cinnamon above it, and later from Indian cotton and Chinese tea. It arrived in Europe not in chests but in hundreds of tons, and the price sagged under the weight of its own abundance. The directors in Amsterdam grumbled about it as a dull commodity with thin margins, which is a remarkable thing to say about the substance that had, within living memory, been weighed against silver. The berry had not changed at all. Only the machinery around it had, and the machinery had grown so large that the thing it was built to carry no longer seemed worth very much. The fall did not happen the way a price falls in a story. There was no morning when the number collapsed and men shouted on a quay. It happened the way a tide goes out, which is to say slowly and mostly at night, and without anyone standing on the shore to watch it. A merchant in Amsterdam in one decade would have said pepper was a little softer than it had been. His son would have said the same thing. His grandson would have stopped saying it at all, because by then it was simply what pepper cost, and nobody remembered it costing anything else. Several things came loose at once, and each of them pulled a little of the price down with it. The first was the ships. The old carracks and the early Indiamen had been built to be everything at once: warehouse, fortress, flagship. They carried guns and men and dignity, and all of that had to be fed and paid for out of the cargo. Then the Dutch began building the Flight, a plain, round-bellied hull with a narrow deck and almost no guns, designed for one purpose only, which was to move a great deal of cargo with a very small crew. It was not a handsome ship. It did not look like power. It looked like a barrel with masts. But it meant that the cost of carrying a ton of anything across an ocean began, quietly, to drop, and once that number starts dropping, it does not easily stop. Hulls grew larger. Rigging grew simpler to work. Later, copper sheathing kept the worm out of the planking and let a ship stay at sea longer between refits. Later still came iron and steam, and a canal cut through the Egyptian desert that turned a voyage of months into a voyage of weeks, and by then the whole shape of the problem had changed. Distance had been the first half of the answer to why pepper was expensive. Distance was getting cheaper every generation. The second thing was the supply. For centuries the word pepper had meant Malabar, and Malabar had meant a strip of wet coast a few hundred miles long. But the vine is not sentimental about geography. It wants heat and rain and something to climb, and there are a great many places in the world that can offer all three. Sumatra had grown pepper for a long time already, and now it grew a great deal more of it, in Aceh at the northern tip, and in the Lampung districts at the southern end, whole hillsides of it, sold down to the ports through the same patient ladder of brokers that Malabar had always used. Banten in West Java became a pepper town, then a contested one, then a possession. Cultivation spread through the archipelago wherever a company or a sultan thought there was money in it, and often wherever they thought there was money in denying it to somebody else. That spread kept going long after the companies were gone. In the 20th century, Japanese settler families in the Brazilian state of Pará put pepper vines into Amazonian soil, and the vines took, and South America became a pepper country, which would have astonished every merchant in this story. Later, on the red basalt uplands of Vietnam, farmers planted pepper alongside coffee and kept planting it, and within a few decades Vietnam was sending out more pepper than anywhere else on Earth. None of these places had needed permission. That was the whole point. A monopoly on the world's pepper had only ever been possible while the world's pepper grew in one place, and the vine had never agreed to that arrangement. And so the berry began to fall out of the documents where it had once been so carefully recorded. This is the part that is easiest to feel. Go back to the wills, those medieval testaments where a man dying in a stone house left, in the same breath, his second-best bed, a silver cup, and a pound of pepper, each named because each was worth naming. Look for those bequests in the 17th century and they thin. Look in the 18th and they are gone. Not because people stopped owning pepper, but because you do not itemize in your last testament the things that anyone can buy. Nobody wills a jar of salt. What replaced it is stranger and rather touching. Pepper turned up in ship stores, listed with the biscuit and the vinegar and the dried peas, a bulk purchase made by a victualling office to keep a crew's food from being entirely intolerable. It turned up in garrison contracts and army provisions, weighed out in hundredweights by clerks who had no idea they were handling the descendant of something that had once been counted grain by grain. The substance that had been used to settle ransoms and pay off rents was now a line item in the feeding of ordinary soldiers, ordered by the barrel, complained about when it was late. One small ghost survived. In English law, a landlord could grant a lease for a peppercorn, a rent so nominal that it was not really a rent at all, only a legal token to show that a bargain existed. The phrase outlived its own meaning by centuries. It is still there in contracts, a peppercorn rent, a fossil of the era when one dried berry was worth troubling a court about. The words remember what the price forgot. Venice felt the tide go out slowly too, and she felt it in her bones. The Republic did not fall because of pepper. Nothing that large has a single cause. But the city had built itself on being the only door, and doors matter less once the wall around them has holes. The cargoes came in smaller. The great state convoys, the muta, which had once sailed on dates fixed by the Senate like the movements of a calendar, sailed less often and then not at all. The arsenal, which had been able to turn out a hull with a speed that frightened visiting ambassadors, grew quieter. Its rope walk still smelled of tar. Its basins still held water. There was simply less reason to hurry. What Venice did instead was become beautiful for a living. Glass from Murano, lace from Burano, printing, painting, music in the ospitally where orphan girls played concerti behind grills for visitors who had come a long way to hear them. Carnival stretched out until it swallowed months of the year. and young Englishmen and Germans on their grand tour came to spend money in a city that had once made its money from other people's necessities, and now made it from their pleasure. The Doge still went out each spring in the Bucentoro, the gilded state barge, to drop a ring into the lagoon and marry the city to the sea. It was a magnificent ceremony. It was also, by then, a performance of an authority that had mostly drained away. In 1797, Napoleon's army arrived on the mainland, and the last Doge, Ludovico Manin, and the Great Council voted the 1,000-year republic out of existence in an afternoon. The Bucentoro was stripped of its gold the following year. There is no cruelty in saying that a city ended up as a pageant. Venice remains one of the loveliest things human beings have made. But the machine underneath it, the ledgers, the galleys, the licensed captains, the pepper quoted on the Rialto like a currency, that machine had already stopped, and the pageant was what stayed lit after the engine went cold. Monopolies leave things behind. That is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the part that outlasts the price. They leave ports, cities that exist where no city would naturally have grown, sited for a company's convenience, a defensible harbor, a river mouth, a place to break bulk. They leave plantations, and the field boundaries and road patterns of a landscape reorganized around a single crop, which is a shape that can persist for 200 years after anyone stops wanting that crop. They leave debts, both the ledger kind and the other kind. The labor that was coerced rather than hired, the islands emptied, the populations moved to where the work was. And they leave borders. When the British and the Dutch sat down in 1824 to stop quarreling over the East Indies, they traded settlements across a table, a post on Sumatra for a post on the Malay Peninsula, and drew a line down the Strait of Malacca to separate their spheres. That line, agreed between two trading interests to tidy up a commercial nuisance, still runs approximately where nations meet today. Millions of people live inside frontiers that began as the punctuation in a merchant settlement. And through all of it, the vine. It is worth saying plainly, because everything else in this chapter has been movement. The vine did not participate. Through the flights and the copper sheathing, through Aceh and Lampung and Pará and the basalt hills of Vietnam, through wills and rations and the stripping of a gilded barge *Piper Nigrum*, went on doing exactly what it had always done. It climbed. It flowered in small pale spikes. It set green berries that were picked by hand and spread on mats and turned black and wrinkled in the sun, and a farmer walked between the rows in the morning and looked at them, the way farmers do, and thought about rain. Nothing about the berry knew that it had been worth silver. Nothing about it knew that it was now worth very little. The whole enormous story, the tolls, the convoys, the fortresses, the burned trees, the drowned ships, had happened entirely on the outside of it, in the world of people. And the world of people had simply rearranged itself around a thing that never moved at all. There is a mill on the table in front of you, or there is one somewhere in the house, in a cupboard beside the salt. It is probably made of wood or of steel, and it has a small knob on the top, and inside it there is a mechanism that has not changed in principle for a very long time. You pick it up without thinking. You turn it 2 or 3 times over whatever is in the pan, and a little dark dust falls, and you put the mill back down and forget about it entirely. That is all. That is the whole ceremony. The most expensive plant matter in medieval Europe, the cargo that was weighed grain by grain against silver in a Venetian counting house, arrives at your table in a container you did not choose, from a shop you cannot remember, at a price you did not notice paying. It costs less than the pan it falls into. It costs less than the electricity used to cook the food. If you spilled the entire contents of the mill on the floor, you would sweep it up and be mildly annoyed for about 4 seconds, and you would not tell anyone, because there would be nothing to tell. Somewhere in a house in Lubeck, 600 years ago, a woman wrote a will. She had a house and some linen and some silver spoons, and she had a small quantity of pepper, and she wrote it down by name so that there would be no arguing later about who received it. That is the distance we have traveled, not the distance of the ships, the distance of attention. The thing has not become less useful. It has only become less visible, and becoming invisible is what abundance does to a thing. We do not see water in a tap. We do not see salt. We do not see the pepper, and we do not see the 400 years of arrangement that ended with us not seeing it. So let us go back along the road one more time, slowly and gently, without hurrying, because there is no hurry left in any part of this. You do not have to follow all of it. If you lose the thread somewhere over the Arabian Sea, that is entirely all right. The thread continues without you. It begins in the rain. It always begins in the rain. A hillside in Kerala, in the wet green country behind the coast, where the monsoon comes in from the southwest and falls for weeks, and the light under the trees stays a kind of dim, underwater green all afternoon. A vine is growing up the trunk of a jackfruit tree. It has been growing there for years. It is not planted in a field. It is planted against something because it needs something to climb, and it climbs slowly, and it will not give fruit for the first few seasons of its life. When it does, the fruit hangs in small green strings, like tiny unripe grapes, and someone reaches up and takes them by hand. They are spread out on mats in the yard. In the sun they darken. In a few days they are black and shrunken and wrinkled and hard, and they smell like the thing you know. A sack is filled. The sack is heavy, and it is worth something, but not very much, and the person who filled it is paid in a local currency at a local price, and goes back to worrying about the weather, which is the only part of this entire story that has never once changed. Then the hands begin. A broker in the village who buys the sack, a middleman on the coast who buys from the broker, a boat down the backwaters and along the shore to a port, and the port is Calicut, with its weighing yards and its warehouses and its smell of drying coir and pepper and salt. The Zamorin's officers take their share at the quay. The harbor master takes his. Merchants from Arabia and from Gujarat sit in the shade and write out credit in scripts that do not match each other, and buy cargoes that are still on the vine, and the price of the sack has already quietly doubled, and it has not yet left India. A dhow loads at night, sitting low in the water. Its planks are sewn, not nailed. It goes west with the wind, because the wind is the timetable and nothing sails against it, and the men aboard navigate by the stars and by the shape of the coast, which they know the way you know the corridor to your own bathroom in the dark. Weeks of open water. Socotra somewhere off to the side. Some of these boats do not arrive. Then Aden or Hormuz, the gates. The cargo is landed and taxed and reloaded and taxed again. Then the Red Sea, and then the sacks come off the water altogether and are lashed to camels, and the water for the journey is counted out by the day, and the caravan goes north through country where nothing grows. Cairo, Alexandria. The Sultan's officials at every gate with their hands out, politely, according to law. Warehouses where the stock is held back for a while, because a merchant who releases everything at once is a merchant who does not understand what he is holding. And then the galleys from the north, riding at anchor outside, waiting to be let in. Venice. The convoys with their fixed sailing dates, the republic that was a shipping company with a navy attached. The Rialto, where pepper was quoted like a currency and sold before it existed and pledged against loans, and the palaces going up along the water paid for out of a ledger. Then over the Alps in barrels on carts to Nuremberg, to Bruges, to London. Then a grocer. Then a kitchen. Then a will and a lock on a small box. 9 or 10 pairs of hands, 4 or 5 empires, 12 months, 6,000 miles. Every hand taking a little. Every gate taking a little. And at the end of it, a berry that a woman in Lubeck thought worth naming in her testament, and that you shook onto your dinner tonight without looking down. And some of the ships did not come back. We should say that once more, quietly, and then let it be. It is easy, when you follow the money, to hear only the arithmetic, the fraction lost, the expected loss written into the price, the 4 hulls carrying one family's cargo so that one sinking would not be the end of them. That is how it was recorded, because that is how ledgers work. But behind the fraction there were people. Men on sewn boats off Socotra in weather that came up faster than anyone could turn. Portuguese crews who left the Tagus and never saw it again. Dutch sailors buried at sea on the long haul south, and dead within sight of Batavia, and dead of nothing more dramatic than bad water. People who were taken from the Banda Islands and never went home. Boys of 15 who signed on for one voyage. We do not have their names, most of them. The ledgers kept the weight of the cargo and not the names of the men who carried it, which tells you something about what the ledgers were for. But they were there, and they are part of what is in the mill on your table, and it costs us nothing to remember them for a moment. Nothing about that memory needs to be frightening. It was all a very long time ago. The sea that took them is calm somewhere tonight, and the ports they sailed from are full of other kinds of boats, and the story has finished happening. There is nothing left in it that can reach you, so let it settle. Let the whole enormous machinery come to rest, the convoys and the tolls and the fortresses on the headlands, The burned trees and the withheld sacks, and the men in counting houses deciding what a thing ought to be worth. All of it wound down, all of it spent. The empires that ran it are gone, and the price they built collapsed, and the only thing that came through the whole 400 years unchanged is the plant. Because it is still there. That is the last thing, and it is the quietest thing. Right now, tonight, on the hills behind the Malabar coast, the vines are still growing up the trunks of trees. It is raining, or it is about to. The water is running off the leaves in the dark and soaking down through the red soil, and the green berries are hanging in their small strings, waiting for a hand in the morning. Nobody out there is thinking about Venice. Nobody is thinking about silver, or about the Rialto, or about a woman in Lubeck and her small locked box. They are thinking about the weather, and about the harvest, and about how the drying mats will need to come in if the rain keeps up. The world rearranged itself around this plant twice, once to make it precious, and once to make it ordinary, and the plant did not notice either time. It simply went on climbing slowly, the way it always has in the rain. The mill is on the table. The kitchen is dark now. Everything that had to sail has sailed, and everything that had to arrive has arrived, and there is nothing at all left for you to carry. It is quite safe to sleep.